Welcome back, everyone. How far women have come and the challenges that still lie ahead will be marked on Sunday, on International Women's Day. Marking such a day began in the early 1900s as women in the US and Europe sought better pay and voting rights. It's now an official holiday in more than 24 countries around the world. This year's theme is Make It Happen. For more on the challenges facing women and girls around the world, I want to bring in Yasmeen Hassan, Global Executive Director of the group Equality Now. She joins us from our studio in New York. Yasmeen, thank you so much for joining us. The issue of sexual violence against India's women and girls is center stage ahead of this year's International Women's Day. Let me ask you this. What do you make of the Indian government's decision to ban the screening of this film, which is really attempting to understand the reasons men rape there in India?
Well, I think governments, this brings me to exactly the point that I wanted to make. Governments have to be accountable for what happens to their women. Women are more than 50% of their citizens. And India's government's decision, I cannot condone it, because getting the issues out there and getting people to look at issues in a way that will move them to change things is essential. I think, but more than India, there's violence against women all around the world. And we have not been able to to end that violence, which has been 20 years ago at the Beijing conference. That was a central issue that came up. And I'll tell you, there's been a lot of progress around the world since that day, because about 20 years ago, domestic violence was just life. Now there are laws against domestic violence in about 125 countries around the world.
Let's unpack some of what you've just said there. Let's look at just what's happened in the last 12 months and some of the big headlines. 200 plus schoolgirls were kidnapped in Nigeria. Reports of mass rape in Sudan's Darfur region. We've heard of sexual slavery of Yazidi women and girls. I could go on with the list of atrocities. The takeaway being here that women's rights are increasingly being threatened around the world. You talk about progress being made, but we're still talking about those rights being under attack. Why is this happening now in the way that it's happening?
Well, again, why it's happening right now is governments are not taking their pledges seriously. There's lip service that is paid for to women's rights all around the world. But when push comes to shove, what are we doing to prevent that? And the key thing that needs to happen there is that there has to be equality for women, legal equality, right? Like the women are being attacked all over the world because they're not seen as equal to men. Girls are not seen as equal to boys. And the first thing that has to happen there is that governments have to make sure that their legal systems treat men and women, girls and boys equally, whether that is equal inheritance rights, whether that is equal rights to marriage, whether that's equal rights to employment. We have just launched our global report on sex discriminatory laws that continue to exist in the world. I'm not saying ending sex discrimination in the law is the final solution, but it is a critical step to getting there.
Okay.
Because,
No, go. I want to pick up on what you're saying there, because as you talk to me, what I hear you saying is at least the first step or a critical step is changing the law. There are those that would say, okay, there's the law, but then there's implementing the law. But others would say it's about changing attitudes, and that it's kind of back to front, some would argue.
Absolutely, and people argue that all the time, and I always take, I don't agree with that, because culture and attitudes, they've never been the same. Look at history, right? Culture is not a static thing, it changes, attitudes change. What plays a part in changing those attitudes? If you're a government, do you have a role to play? How did China end foot binding, for example? How did domestic violence become an issue in countries like Austria, which is hailed as, having the best law in there? Governments have to prioritize this thing. You cannot say, let's not have a law because people are not ready. You have the law and you back the government. Government has to back it with resources to implement the law. And things will change. It's complex. It's not the only thing, but it is an essential first thing. And when we are holding governments accountable right now on the International Women's Day and the 20th anniversary of the Beijing conference that's happening in the UN all of next week and the week after, then governments can be held accountable. It's very hard. It's very easy to say culture, attitude, we can't change it. But there are things we can do, and there are things governments can do right now, this minute.
As you talk about things we can do, that brings me to civil society and the role of civil society in this fight to change these attitudes and to see these laws passed. What's your view of the role civil society should be playing in these areas, in these countries?
I think civil societies are playing a huge role, almost too big a role, right? So when I'm talking about sex discriminatory laws, every law that's been changed has had civil society behind it, lobbying for it. It's a lot of work, and we are all very under-resourced. And when we've pointed out the issue, I think it behooves governments to take a look at all their legislation and change laws without putting civil society in the middle of it. Civil society has a lot of stuff to do, and where you can make it easier for them and work hand in hand and in partnership with civil society, governments should do that. The other part of it is there are laws that are coming into being which are restrictive of civil society, and that is very, very problematic because women and girls in some of the countries that really need help of civil society, they're clamping down on civil society. So that's another issue that we will bring up at this Commission on the Status of Women at the UN this year.
Well, I'm so pleased that you're part of that conversation. It's an essential one, and it's great to have you on the show today. Yasmeen Hassan, a Global Executive Director of the group Equality Now.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.